The man walked into a kiosk and asked for yesterday's paper. But what was he really looking for? Welcome to the Whimsy Casebook. I am your host, William. I love seeing this community grow. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Your comments mean the world to me. I always look forward to reading them. Let's begin. Maigret stood at the window of his office, smoking slowly, the thick stem of his pipe heavy between his teeth. Outside, the rain was falling in that indecisive, maddening Parisian way. Neither a drizzle nor a downpour, just the kind that settled into the skin and made every corner of the city feel like a damp overcoat left too long in the cold. He wasn't thinking of any case in particular. It was a Wednesday, late afternoon. The gas heater clicked faintly in the corner. On his desk lay a folder he hadn't opened all day. The typed report from the previous week's burglary on Rue des Archives. Predictable, impersonal, nothing about it had moved him. He had half a mind to go home early. Madame Maigret would be stewing lamb. He could smell it even from here. Or perhaps he imagined it. She had mentioned it that morning as he buttoned his coat, brushing a bit of lint from his lapel the way she always did. "Don't forget to bring bread," she'd said gently, and he had nodded. It was a small thing, but it always made him feel grounded, as though life, even for an old police commissaire, could still be gently predictable. The door creaked open. Lucas poked his head in. "Someone asking for you, Chief. Says it's not urgent, but odd." Maigret turned, taking the pipe from his mouth. "Odd how?" Lucas shrugged, entering fully now. His coat was damp at the shoulders. "A man came into the lobby asking to speak with the one who listens." Said it exactly like that. Not the chief inspector or Maigret. Just the one who listens. Maigret didn't answer immediately. He tamped the pipe gently on the ashtray and rubbed a thumb along the stem. Then he nodded toward the hallway. "Send him in." Lucas left, and a moment later a short, narrow-shouldered man appeared in the doorway. He wore a dark blue suit, slightly too tight, and held a folded umbrella that dripped onto the linoleum. His shoes were polished but worn. The lapel of his coat bore a pale thread where a badge or pin had once been. Perhaps military, perhaps a union. "You asked for me," Maigret said, motioning him toward the chair. The man nodded and sat, careful not to lean back. "I don't have a complaint," he began. His voice was low and deliberate, as if testing each word. "I haven't been robbed. Nothing like that. I know this is unusual." Maigret studied him, noting how his hands gripped the brim of his hat too tightly. Not nervous, exactly. More like someone trying to hold something in place. "And yet you came here." "I did," he hesitated, "because this morning I asked the kiosk woman at Rue Claude Bernard for yesterday's paper, and when she gave it to me, she looked at me like I was mad. I read it twice. I read it over coffee, and then again on the train to Saint-Lazare. Every word." He paused. Maigret waited. There was a small notice. A death announcement, nothing grand, just Janine Latour, née Lemoyne, passed peacefully at home. Private ceremony held. Maigret drew in a slow puff from his pipe. "Someone you knew?" The man's jaw tightened. "That's just it. I didn't... Not really. Not since I was 19. 31 years ago, she was the sister of a friend. We danced once, in a basement in Montmartre during the winter of 23. And then... nothing. Life, you know." Maigret said nothing. He let the silence work. "I don't know why I needed to see it. I don't believe in ghosts. I didn't even know she was still alive. But this morning, something told me to look for yesterday's paper. Not today's. Yesterday's. And now you're here. The man gave a weak smile. I suppose I wanted someone to tell this to, someone who'd understand that it isn't about the paper. It's about what the paper reminded me of. Maigret rose slowly, walked to the window. The rain was still falling, steady now, smearing the rooftops in a film of melancholy gray. What's your name? Raymond Villette. I work in accounting at the Compagnie des Transports du Nord. And what would you like me to do, Monsieur Villette? I don't know. I suppose I'd like to know where she died, who she was with. If anyone even remembers her, there was no accusation in his voice, no implication of foul play, just a kind of moral discomfort, the sort that comes with the death of someone once known, now vanished. Maigret looked at the man and then back out the window. He didn't feel the stirrings of a case. Not exactly. But there was something in Villette's face. Something unsaid. Give me the clipping. Villette unfolded it carefully from his pocket and laid it on the desk like an offering. Maigret took it. The print was smudged slightly. No address, no mention of survivors, just the name, Jeanine Latour, née Lemoyne. Do you know where she lived? No, only that it said, at home. Maigret nodded. All right, I'll ask around. Villette stood, unsure whether to offer his hand. Thank you, Chief Inspector. Don't thank me yet. I haven't done anything. The man left, and Maigret remained at the window a moment longer. Outside, a tram clanged its way down Boulevard Saint-Michel, sparks flickering as it rounded the wet corner. He didn't know why he was interested. He just was. Sometimes that was enough. He folded the clipping and slipped it into his coat pocket. Maybe he'd stop by the press bureau before going home. Or not. Maybe he'd just walk a while. In the rain, where the truth waited, quietly. The corridors of the Quai des Orfèvres held their own kind of weather. A stale, institutional stillness that stood apart from the ever-changing moods of the Paris streets. Inside, time seemed more reluctant to move. It wasn't just the stone walls or the flickering lights. It was the way people spoke in half-whispers, the way footsteps echoed faintly, as though secrets lingered in the air like dust that refused to settle. Maigret stepped out into the rain a little after 5, the folded newspaper clipping in his pocket. He didn't take the car. It was better to walk, his coat collar turned up, hat settled low, pipe unlit between his teeth. He made his way slowly toward the Latin Quarter. The streets were quieter than usual, the shops beginning to close, the yellow light from cafes already warming the windows with promise of shelter. It wasn't an investigation, not yet. He wasn't even sure what it was. A mood, perhaps. A quiet echo from the past. Not his own, but someone else's. Maigret had learned long ago that such things had weight, that human memory, even misplaced, could leave footprints. He stopped briefly outside a bookstore on Rue Soufflot, glancing at the window display. A row of novels and academic tomes, their spines softened by time. The street reminded him of students, of dusty offices with forgotten files, of the smell of wet paper. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked twice and then fell silent. When he reached the kiosk at Rue Clos Bernard, it was already being shuttered. A woman with hair wrapped in a green scarf was pulling down the metal flap. Maigret approached slowly, as one might approach someone tired at the end of their day. "Madame," he said gently, "I believe a gentleman came to you this morning asking for yesterday's paper." The woman straightened, brushing her hands on her apron. She looked at him with a mix of suspicion and exhaustion. Yes, rather strange. I told him I don't usually keep them, but I had one left. I thought perhaps he wanted the crossword. And what did he look like? She hesitated, then gave a little shrug. Average, blue suit, clean. He said thank you 3 times, very polite. Maigret nodded. Do you remember the death notice he might have seen? She frowned, thinking. Hard to say. I don't read them closely, but I do remember a name. Latour. That caught my eye because my mother's neighbor is a Latour, though not the same. Did it say where she died? Just at home, I think. No address. Maigret thanked her and moved on, lighting his pipe under the small awning of a closed butcher shop. The flame struggled in the wind. Finally catching, he drew in once, letting the warmth settle behind his ribs. Across the street stood a cafe he had once visited during a case. A forgettable theft, the kind that ends in tired denials, and a missing watch never recovered. He crossed, entered, and took a corner seat. The waiter, young, with a permanent look of fatigue, brought him a demi of beer without being asked. A quiet understanding. Maigret laid the clipping on the table and read it again. Jeanine Latour, née Lemoine, passed peacefully at home. Private ceremony held. He underlined the words in his mind. Passed peacefully. Private ceremony. Both vague, both perfectly normal. But to Maigret they carried a certain hollowness, as if chosen to avoid questions. He leaned back, eyes drifting toward the windows. The rain blurred the view, and people passed in hunched silhouettes, umbrellas like domes of secrecy. Who placed the notice? Who was left to care? He took a sip of his beer and reached into his coat for a small notebook. Not the official kind, just one he kept for moments like this. He jotted the name again, then, beneath it, slowly, the words. Villette. Compagnie des Transports du Nord, Rue Claude Bernard Kiosque. No address, no relatives listed, no mention of church or burial. Then he paused, tapping the pen gently. The question was not whether a crime had occurred, it was whether someone had vanished in plain sight, and whether anyone had truly noticed. He paid, stepped back into the rain, and turned toward Boulevard de Port-Royal. There, tucked between a tobacco shop and a hairdresser, was a modest bureau de presse. Inside, 2 clerks were sorting print bundles and arguing softly about invoices. Maigret showed his badge but kept his tone light. I'm looking for the person who submitted a notice in yesterday's paper. This one. He handed them the clipping. The older of the 2 clerks, a man with spectacles hanging halfway down his nose, took it and nodded slowly. I remember this one. Quiet woman. Middle-aged. Brought it in herself. Paid cash. Did she give her name? No, but she signed the paper A. Fontaine, I believe. That's required. Still, it doesn't have to be a legal name. Did she seem upset? The man looked over his glasses. No more than anyone placing that kind of notice. Wore a brown coat, the kind with fur trim at the collar. Not young, perhaps 50. Thank you, Maigret said. Would you recognize her again? Perhaps. Hard to say. Back outside, the wind had picked up. The city felt colder now. He turned onto Rue Brocas, walking slowly past shuttered shops, letting his thoughts unravel like smoke. Jeanine Latour. A woman long forgotten by the man who once danced with her in Montmartre, a name that would have gone unnoticed if not for a curious impulse and a lingering memory. And now a quiet chain of questions, one link at a time. Back at headquarters, Maigret returned to his office without speaking to anyone. He hung his coat on the peg, shook out the wetness from his hat, and set the small notebook beside the ashtray. There were ways to find her. The birth records for Janine Lemoyne, the marriage registry for Latour. Maybe she had an address in the files. Perhaps no one had looked in years. Still, something about it kept tugging at him. The phrase, "the one who listens." He had heard variations before, but never quite that. It wasn't flattery. It was a kind of quiet desperation. He lit his pipe again, this time letting it rest between his fingers as he stared at the ceiling. The Bureau of Records could wait until morning. He wanted to think first. Not act, not question, just think. He knew better than most that answers didn't come when chased. They came in stillness, in the pause between one question and the next. And so he sat in silence, as the city outside whispered its soft, wet rhythm. And somewhere, in that silence, a story waited to be noticed. Maigret arrived at the Civil Registry Office the following morning just after 9. The clouds still hung low over Paris, leaden and indifferent, but the rain had paused for the moment, leaving behind wet cobblestones and the scent of damp stone that clung to the facades of buildings like old perfume. The Bureau of Vital Records was housed in a narrow municipal building off Rue de Turenne, one of those places that still smelled of carbon paper and boiled coffee. Inside, it was as quiet as a chapel. A single radiator ticked faintly under a frosted window, and 2 clerks shuffled papers behind a long counter with the deliberation of men who had made peace with routine. Maigret waited without announcing himself. He knew the rhythm of this place. For 30 years he had watched Paris unspool from its seams through people's birth and death records, through forgotten permits and yellowed marriage certificates. The city was layered in paper, and here was where the sediment gathered. Eventually, a tall, reed-thin clerk with a waxed mustache approached. He gave a small bow when he recognized Maigret, though not from any particular familiarity, only from the quiet reverence civil servants had for those who still walked slowly and didn't raise their voices. "I'm looking for a death registration," Maigret said. "Janine Latour, née Lemoyne. Died within the past few days, I assume?" The clerk nodded and disappeared behind a side door. Maigret remained standing, his eyes trailing the lines of worn tile on the floor. The rhythm of such places calmed him. Here, nothing was rushed. Names didn't vanish. They lingered in alphabetical order, even when no one came looking. When the man returned, he carried a small folder with a brown label. "Registered 2 days ago," the clerk said, "by an Anna Fontaine. Address listed as Rue du Moulin des Prés, number 37, 6th floor, no elevator." Maigret raised an eyebrow. That was a working-class street in the 13th arrondissement, full of laundry smells, clinking bottles, and apartments that creaked under the weight of shared silence. "Cause of death?" he asked. The clerk flipped a page. "Cerebral hemorrhage, certified by a Dr. Rouvier of the same arrondissement." Maigret nodded slowly. "Was the body cremated?" "Buried. Père Lachaise. Unmarked grave, communal plot. And the woman who registered the death?" "Fontaine." "Is there any known relation?" "No relation specified. Not unusual, but not common either." Maigret took the information down in his notebook, thanked the man, and made his way back out into the wet morning. The clouds had thickened again, and umbrellas bobbed through the street like dark beetles. He stopped for a quick coffee at a zinc counter near the metro. The cup was hot and slightly bitter, the way he liked it, no sugar. As he drank, he reviewed the facts. Janine Latour, buried quietly, no next of kin noted. Anne Fontaine had placed the notice and registered the death. That was twice the same name. But why the secrecy? Why no mention of survivors, no invitation to mourn? Rue de Moulin-des-Prés was a long walk, but Maigret preferred it. He liked the city in motion, liked its small noises and shifting smells. Paris revealed more of itself on foot than from the back seat of a police car. He passed a bakery, its windows fogged with steam, then a butcher stringing sausages on hooks. A boy in a red cap walked by singing something out of tune, dragging a school bag behind him. Number 37 was a tall, narrow building with a chipped doorway and a brass bell that stuck when pressed. Maigret pushed it in, heard a muffled buzz, and let himself in. The stairwell smelled of cooked cabbage and coal dust. He climbed slowly, boots echoing on the worn wooden steps. By the time he reached the 6th floor, he was out of breath in that quiet, middle-aged way. Not gasping, just aware of the years. A door at the end of the hall bore the number 6B, a faded B scratched into the paint with something blunt. He knocked once, firmly. It opened after a few moments. A woman in her early 50s looked out. She wore a brown house coat over a simple blue dress, her graying hair pulled back with care, not elegant, but tidy. Her face was one that had grown used to listening, not speaking. "Yes?" "Anne Fontaine?" Maigret asked. She gave a quick, almost imperceptible nod. "I'm Chief Inspector Maigret. May I come in?" There was no visible hesitation, just a small motion of the hand inviting him inside. The apartment was narrow, a long corridor with 3 rooms branching off. A bedroom, a kitchen, and a salon. It smelled faintly of starch and lavender. A teapot whistled softly on the stove. Maigret removed his coat and sat where she indicated, a modest armchair near a curtained window. She turned off the flame beneath the kettle and joined him, folding her hands in her lap. "I'm not here on official business," Maigret began. "I saw the death notice, and I'm curious. About Janine Latour." A pause. "I see. You placed the notice. You registered the death. Yet no one else seems to know she existed." "She was private," Fontaine said. "We both were." Maigret waited. He didn't prod. The room was quiet enough that he could hear the ticking of a small wall clock. "She rented the back room. Lived there nearly 8 years. Never spoke of family. Paid in cash. Sometimes late. I never asked questions. We weren't friends exactly. But we shared a silence." "She died 2 nights ago?" "Yes." "She collapsed in the corridor. I called the doctor. There was nothing to be done. I sat with her until morning. She didn't like hospitals." "She never mentioned anyone from her past?" "She once said she had danced in Montmartre, long ago. Nothing more. And her belongings?" Fontaine looked toward the back room. "Few clothes. A small case of letters, locked. I don't have the key. She told me once that if anything ever happened, I should burn them. I didn't." Maigret nodded slowly. "May I see the room?" She led him through the narrow corridor. The door was already open. Inside it was clean if Spartan. A bed neatly made, a chair, a side table with an old lamp. A small wooden case sat at the foot of the bed, its brass lock tarnished. Maigret didn't touch it, not yet. He looked around. Nothing screamed of secrets, but the absence of detail was a detail in itself. The wallpaper was faded, the curtains handmade. No photos, no books, just a life pared down to its quietest edges. Back in the salon, he turned once more to Anne Fontaine. You cared for her. Fantine didn't speak, but her hands moved slightly, clasping one another in rhythm. I did, she said at last, but she never let me in. Maigret stood, thanked her again, and made his way back down the 6 flights of stairs. Outside, the rain had returned, finer now, more persistent. He walked on, the name Jeanine Latour pressing quietly at the edge of his thoughts. She had lived like a whisper, died like a breath, and left behind only a lockbox, a stranger's memory, and a question folded in silence. And Maigret, as ever, would wait for the silence to speak. The rain had settled into a thin mist by the time Maigret reached the corner cafe near Place d'Italie. He ducked inside, welcomed by the warmth and the clink of porcelain. The place was half empty. A pensioner reading L'Intransigeant by the window, a young couple murmuring over shared toast, and the waiter polishing cutlery with an air of theatrical disinterest. Maigret took his usual spot against the back wall and ordered a bowl of coffee and a croissant, though he didn't feel particularly hungry. His thoughts were still in that narrow apartment on Rue du Moulin des Prés, in the pale hallway, and the sound of Anna Fontaine's even voice as she said, "We weren't friends exactly, but we shared—" Silence. That sentence had stayed with him. Few people chose silence. Fewer shared it, and when they did, it meant something, a pact, almost, unspoken yet binding. In Maigret's world, silence could be guilt, but it could also be grief. The waiter set the bowl before him. Maigret dipped the corner of the croissant in and let it soak. The taste was bland, comforting, like a childhood memory. He opened his notebook and reread the sparse lines. Jeanine Latour, back room, 8 years. No known visitors, paid in cash, small locked case. Once danced in Montmartre, mentioned no family. He tapped the page with his pen, then added, Fantine. Reserved, loyal, pressed notice and registered death still withheld something, not out of deceit, but protection? There were no contradictions. Yet, no timelines that didn't match, no evidence, just people and a soft question forming in the air between them. By mid-morning, the clouds thinned slightly, and the faintest blue edged in behind the slate gray. Maigret stood, left a few francs on the table, and decided to walk toward Montmartre. He had no destination, but the place itself mattered. If Jeanine had once danced there, it meant she had lived, perhaps even hoped. En Rue des Martyrs, time had not quite managed to erase the traces of what it once was. Cafes with faded signs, shuttered dance halls turned into laundromats, old men playing cards beneath the awning of a tabac. Maigret paused in front of a storefront with yellowing photos taped inside. Black and white images of dances from another era. Legs mid-kick, arms flung wide in joy or routine. The photos weren't labeled, but Maigret found himself scanning them anyway, as if Jeanine might be among them. A face he wouldn't recognize. A youth long vanished. He stepped into a small florist's shop next door, not because he expected information, but because florists noticed things. The shop was narrow, filled with scent and soft petals. Behind the counter stood a woman of about 70, her hair dyed the red of autumn leaves and tied into a neat chignon. She wore red gloves, an affectation, perhaps, or simply warmth. Maigret removed his hat. Madame, forgive the question. I'm looking into someone who may have lived nearby many years ago. Danced here possibly in the early 1000, 920s. Jeanine Lemoyne, later Jeanine Latour. The woman blinked slowly. That was another Montmartre, she said. Back then we had music in the streets, and more wine than truth. Maigret smiled faintly. But you remember the name? I remember the girls. The ones who danced came and went. Many use different names. Easier that way, but yes.
Janine Lemoyne, you said.
Yes, Lemoyne. She tugged at one of her gloves, thinking. There was a Janine, slender, dark-eyed, didn't speak much, danced at Le Bal Parnasse. It was on Rue Tardieu, where the bakery is now. She wasn't flashy like the others, always wore the same pale dress, looked sad even when she smiled. Did she have family, friends?
None I knew of.
She often sat alone after the shows. Sometimes a man would join her. Always the same one. Quiet. Not young. Had the air of someone who read newspapers with intensity. Do you remember his name? She shook her head. No. But he wore a silver tie-pin shaped like a key. Funny thing to recall, isn't it? Maigret nodded. Funny. But people often remembered the useless details best. Did she vanish suddenly? No, just faded like so many did. One night she was there, the next she wasn't. We heard she'd gone to Toulouse. Then nothing.
Thank you,
Maigret said, and turned to leave. The florist called after him. She looked lonely, that girl, like someone who had already lost the best part of her story. Maigret walked slowly down the slope of Rue Lamarck. The picture was still forming, not clearly, not yet, but pieces were coming together. That afternoon, back at headquarters, he summoned Lucas and asked him to pull the civil records for both Janine Lemoyne and Anna Fontaine. Birth certificates, past addresses, anything unusual. Lucas, with his practical hands and steady efficiency, returned an hour later. Found something strange, he said, laying 2 folders on Maigret's desk. Janine Lemoyne, born 1904, Montreuil, married Jules Latour in 28, but he died the following year, no children. After that, no trace of her until a rental form in 1943. She shared a room near Rue Ordina with Anna Fontaine. Maigret raised his eyebrows. So they knew each other that far back? Apparently. And another thing. Fontaine listed her occupation in the 1940s as a domestic for a Monsieur R. Villette. That name sat like a stone on the desk. Raymond Villette. Maigret leaned back, pipe in hand. He let the silence grow. Raymond Villette. The man who came in asking for yesterday's paper. A faint connection. A thread, but what did it mean? If Fontaine had once worked for Villette, and Janine had been her lodger decades later, then the triangle was older, tighter, and far more human than chance. Maigret looked at the clock. It was nearly 5. The day's weight settled gently on his shoulders. Outside, the clouds had begun to break. He made no move to call anyone, not yet. Instead, he opened his drawer and pulled out the clipping once more. It had yellowed slightly at the edges since the day before. Janine Latour, née Lemoyne, passed peacefully at home. Private ceremony held. Peaceful, yeah, but perhaps not simple. He reached for his pen and added one more name beneath the others in his notebook. R. Villette. Employer to A. Fontaine. Connection unclear. Motive unknown. And then, as always, he waited. He would not knock too hard. He would not push too fast. The truth, he knew, had its own pace. The corridors of the Compagnie des Transports du Nord smelled of floor polish and faded ink. Maigret had always found something faintly melancholic about office buildings. Not the grand ones with chandeliers and marble staircases, but these narrow utilitarian spaces where daylight slanted weakly through dusty panes and typewriters clacked with stubborn regularity. A young woman in horn-rimmed glasses led him down a hallway to an open-plan room where rows of clerks sat at high desks, heads bowed, pencils moving in soft rhythm. At the far end, behind a small partition of frosted glass, was the name he had noted in his book, Raymond Villette. He was standing when Maigret arrived, as if expecting him, though the inspector had not phoned ahead. Something in Villette's manner had always suggested a man waiting for a visitor no one else could see. He was dressed much the same as before, a blue suit, modestly pressed, a tie with a discreet diagonal stripe. His desk was tidy. A calendar hung on the wall, still turned to the previous month.
"Inspector,"
he said softly, almost with relief. "Good afternoon, Monsieur Villette. Do you have a moment?" The man gestured to a chair. Maigret sat. He noticed that on the desk lay a copy of Le Figaro, folded carefully open to the obituaries. Today's edition.
"You still reading them?"
Maigret asked. Villette offered a pale smile. "Old habit. My father did the same, said it was the only part of the paper where truth was guaranteed." Maigret didn't return the smile. He opened his notebook slowly. "You said the name Jeanine Latour meant little to you. A memory, a dance in a basement during the winter of 23. Nothing more?" "Yes." "But you didn't mention that your former housemaid, Anna Fontaine, had lived with her for years." Villette's eyes didn't flinch, but the pause that followed said more than a blink would have.
"I didn't think it mattered."
"It does. It suggests that you knew more about Jeanine than you admitted. That she was not just a passing acquaintance." Villette leaned back slightly, adjusting his cuffs as if buying time. "It's not what you think." Maigret waited. "After she danced in Montmartre, Jeanine fell on hard times. That much I know. She ended up working odd jobs, sewing, bookkeeping for cafes, cleaning apartments. Fontaine worked for me from 39 until 42. She had a steady way about her. Unremarkable, but loyal. One winter she mentioned a woman who had nowhere to go. I said she could bring her in for a few weeks."
"That was Jeanine."
"And she stayed?" "For a time, yes. But I never saw her directly again. Fontaine kept her separate. Said the woman preferred solitude." Maigret nodded. The words were precise. Too precise. "And you never visited her? Not even in later years?"
"No."
Maigret took out the small folder Lucas had prepared and placed it quietly on the desk. "This says otherwise. It notes a payment from your personal account to Madame Fontaine's rent in 1947. And another in 1952. Nothing official, just money orders issued quarterly. No names attached, but traceable." Villette's hands remained folded. He didn't move. Maigret continued, voice low and calm. "It also says you had a silver tie-pin shaped like a key. A woman at a florist's in Montmartre remembered it. She remembered you, or someone like you, sitting with Jeanine after her dances, watching her. Always the same quiet man." At last Villette spoke, not defensively, not with bluster, but with something closer to shame. "I was married, Inspector. Not happily, not unhappily either. It was a marriage like many others. But Jeanine, she was something else. A brief thing. A feeling I couldn't explain. There was never anything improper. But I watched her dance. I gave her money once. Nothing more. And yet for 30 years you followed her obituary pages."
"I didn't want to forget."
Maigret sat back, letting the weight of the moment settle between them. Outside the window a tram rolled by slowly, its metal body humming like a distant sigh. "Why now?" Maigret asked. "Why come to me of all people?" "Because when I read her name in that death notice, that simple, stripped-down line, I realized no one else would ask anything about her. Not the priest, not the city, not even her neighbors. Only Fontaine. And Fontaine, yes? She never forgave me. For not doing more. For stepping away. I think that's why she put her name on the notice. Not to claim Janine, but to accuse me. Maigret closed the folder. It was beginning to feel less like a mystery and more like a bruise. I don't believe Janine was murdered, he said, nor hidden, but I do believe she was lost, and no one tried to find her until it was too late. Billette nodded once, heavily.
Do you intend to make this official?
Maigret shook his head. There's no charge for regret. He stood slowly. The office felt colder now, though the radiator clanked on behind them. Billette did not follow him to the door. As Maigret walked back through the clerk's room, none of them looked up. The world had not shifted for them. But in one corner behind one partition, something had come unstuck. Back on the street, the clouds had begun to break. A shaft of sunlight hit the pavement near the curb, unexpected and almost fragile. Maigret lit his pipe and considered his next step. The pieces were falling together, not into a picture of crime, but of quiet ruin. The kind people carried around for years without showing it. Fontaine had known, Villette had avoided, and Janine had faded into the spaces between their lives. There was still the matter of the locked case. And Fontaine's part in all of this, the way she had spoken, carefully, as though some emotion still curled beneath her ribs like an unexpressed letter. He would visit her again. But not yet. He had learned that truth surfaced only when ready, and some confessions required no questions. Only presence. For now, he walked. The sun vanished behind a moving cloud, and the air turned cool again. In the distance, a bell rang. Faint and solitary, as if Paris had just remembered something it meant to forget. That evening, the air over Paris felt unusually still. The rain had not returned, but the streets remained wet, reflecting the glow of street lamps in broken golden fragments. The Seine, dark and slow, slid beneath the bridges without urgency, and Maigret, walking along the quay, had the sense of a city holding its breath. He was in no rush to return home. Madame Maigret would already be preparing dinner, something with onions, perhaps, judging by the season, and would be half expecting him, and half not, as always. He would call her from the office before heading home. That had become a ritual. One of those gentle negotiations between husband and duty. Back at Quai des Orfèvres, the building had emptied of its daytime bustle. The night shift had begun, but the voices were fewer, the phones quieter. Maigret entered his office, shrugged off his coat, and sat heavily behind his desk. The small lamp on the corner of the blotter gave off a soft amber light. He didn't turn on the overheads. This hour was for thought, not paperwork. He removed his notebook and opened it to the most recent page. The names stared back at him in his own handwriting. Jenny Latour, Anna Fontaine, Raymond Villette, each of them, ordinary on the surface, had been engaged in something delicate. A triangle of silence that had spanned decades, held together not by lies but by omission, habit, and quiet fear. There had been no crime, no violence, no disappearance, only the slow erosion of connection, the way wind wears down stone. And yet, there remained the locked case, the one Janine had told Fontaine to burn. That was a contradiction, Maigret thought, to ask for destruction, yet leave the object in plain sight, as if she had hoped her request would be ignored. He picked up the telephone and dialed the number Fontaine had given. After a few rings, her voice answered, soft and composed.
Madame Fontaine, it's Maigret. I hope I'm not disturbing you.
No, Inspector, I was just boiling water. I'd like to come by tomorrow morning. There's something I'd like to look at again. The box, mainly. There was a pause. Not hesitation, just a brief quiet. "Of course, I'll be here." Maigret thanked her and hung up. He didn't sleep deeply that night. He awoke once around 3 and sat at the edge of the bed, listening to the ticking of the wall clock. Madame Maigret stirred but did not wake. He lit his pipe, smoked in silence, and stared into the shadows of the wardrobe, as though the answers might arrange themselves there in the dark. The following morning brought a thin, metallic light. Paris looked pale, as if rubbed raw from too much gray. Maigret left early, coat buttoned to the throat, and stopped at a bakery near the Gobelins for a warm brioche and a flask of coffee. He brought enough for 2. At precisely 8:30, he knocked again at the door of 6B on Rue du Moulin des Prés. Fontaine opened it in her brown housecoat, a scarf knotted at her neck. Her hair was brushed back, but her face looked tired, more drawn than the day before. "I brought breakfast," Maigret said. "Brioche and coffee." She didn't smile, but she stepped aside to let him in. They sat in the small kitchen, the table covered in a plastic cloth with a print of lemons. She fetched 2 chipped mugs and he poured the coffee. "Did you think I would come back?" he asked after a moment. "I wasn't sure, but I hoped you would." He studied her quietly. "Why?" "Because there's something in that box that I couldn't bring myself to burn. Not because I disobeyed her, but because it didn't feel like the end of her story." They finished their coffee in silence. Then she led him down the corridor, back to the narrow room where Janine had spent her final years. The box was still at the foot of the bed. Small, wooden, no larger than a drawer. The lock looked old, the brass dull with age. "I don't have the key," Fontaine said. "She kept it on a chain around her neck, but after she passed, I never found it." Maigret crouched beside the box and examined the lock. He'd seen worse. From his coat pocket he drew a small folding tool. Not official issue, just something he'd carried for years. With careful pressure and a bit of coaxing, the lock clicked. He looked up at Fontaine, who nodded faintly. Inside were papers, dozens of them, folded letters, bound with ribbon, some yellowed with age, others fresher. There were photographs, too, black and white, some creased, others blurred at the corners. No valuables, no hidden cash, just words. Memory, preserved in ink. He pulled one letter free and opened it carefully. The handwriting was tight and slanted, unmistakably Janine's. Terrar. "I saw you on the tram today, though you did not see me. I stood behind the glass and watched you read the paper, your brow furrowed just so. I imagined you still think of me, though not in the way you once did. I do not fault you for that. I was never meant to be anyone's permanent thought. Only a season, perhaps. Still, I write these letters because I need somewhere to place the part of me that remembers. Yours, always, J." He put the letter down. Fontaine had not moved. "Did you read them all?" he asked. "Only one. The first. And then I stopped. They weren't meant for me, but I couldn't throw them away either. I thought, perhaps one day someone would understand. They were never sent. No. She wrote them, folded them, and tied them with that ribbon. Always the same ribbon, like a ritual." Maigret took another letter at random. This one was shorter. "Ah, I think today you looked for me. You lingered at the old corner, where the florist used to be. I almost called out. But what would I say? That I still live in the same room? That I still eat from the same plate? You had your life to build. I did not wish to be a ghost." He closed the box. "She loved him. Maigret said simply.
Yes,
Fontaine replied.
but she lived without expecting him to return. That was the difference.
And you? Fontaine looked at him then, the first time she met his gaze fully.
I loved her, in my own way. Not romantically, but with loyalty. We lived parallel lives. Quietly, behind others' stories,
Maigret stood. I won't be taking the letters. They're not evidence of anything, not in the legal sense. She nodded.
But you understand now, don't you?
I do. He stepped out into the corridor. The apartment behind him remained as it was, dim, modest, and filled with unsent letters. Down on the street, Paris had begun to move. Stalls opened, bicycles clicked past. Somewhere a radio played an old chanson, warbling faintly through an open window. Maigret lit his pipe and walked slowly toward the metro. There would be no file for this case, no report, just the knowledge that something had almost disappeared. A whole life, nearly erased, but someone had asked for yesterday's paper. And that somehow had saved her from silence. By the time Maigret reached his office at Quai des Orfèvres, it was nearly 11. The clouds were gathering again, more out of habit than threat, and a soft breeze stirred litter across the pavement in loose spirals. Paris was at work, but sluggishly. You could sense it in the footsteps of the clerks and the way cyclists lingered at corners longer than they needed to. A city humming, but in a lower key. Lucas met him at the landing with a paper in hand and his usual quiet efficiency. No telegrams. No calls. But this came by courier from the prefecture. A request for your signature on last week's case summary. Maigret waved it off. Later. He passed through the office like a figure brushing through smoke. Neither hurried nor slow, only inevitable. In his own office, he removed his coat and placed the wooden box, now relocked, on the desk. Its presence felt symbolic now. Not evidence, not a clue, just a relic. A container of feelings, never released. He stared at it for some time. It wasn't that he didn't know what to do next. It was that the next steps were no longer procedural. The box had done something strange to the nature of the case. It had shifted it from investigation to understanding. At noon he made a decision. Not dramatic, not strategic, just quiet and final. He rose, fetched his hat, and left again without telling anyone where he was going. The tram to Les Valois moved slowly, rattling through neighborhoods that Maigret rarely visited unless duty required it. Low buildings, shops with sun-bleached awnings, small public gardens where old men fed pigeons without conversation. He watched it all roll past with a kind of detached intimacy, as though he'd seen the same scene 100 times in different cities, in different lives. He stepped off near Rue Collonges and walked 3 blocks until he reached a pale green door with the number 19B in peeling gold paint. The building was modest, its facade cracked with years of rain and time, but the curtains were clean behind the windows. A place that did not aspire to charm, only order. He rang once, then waited. The door opened slowly, and there stood Raymond Villette, wearing the same blue suit, the tie a bit looser now. His eyes registered neither surprise nor discomfort. If anything, he looked as though he had been expecting Maigret in some remote part of his conscience. "May I come in?" Maigret asked. Villette stepped aside. The apartment was tidy, filled with soft furniture in faded tones, a shelf of books on municipal law, a chessboard set mid-game though no opponent in sight, and a smell of polished wood and old tobacco. On a side table sat a glass ashtray, untouched. Maigret did not sit. "I saw Fontaine this morning," he said. "She showed me the box." Villette lowered his eyes.
I suspected she might. That's why I never asked for it."
Maigret took a slow breath. "I read 2 of the letters." He let the sentence sit. "No accusation, no weight, just fact." Villette gave the barest of nods.
"They weren't meant for anyone, I think, not even for me."
"No," Maigret agreed. "They were meant for the space between 2 people who were never quite together." A silence fell between them, the kind not meant to be filled. Finally, Maigret continued. "She never sent them. Not one, but she kept them. Not hidden, not buried, as if waiting for someone to read them."
"Do you think that someone is me?"
"I think she hoped it would be." Villette walked slowly to the window, one hand resting on the sill. Outside, a cat stretched beneath a tree, oblivious. "I saw her once," he said suddenly, not turning. 10 years ago, by chance, near the bridge at Austerlitz. She didn't see me, or maybe she did. We passed each other, no words. But she knew. And I knew."
"Why didn't you stop her?"
"Because it was too late. Because I was too small." Maigret said nothing. Villette turned back to him.
"I came to you not because of guilt, but because I felt the edge of vanishing. When I saw her name in that paper, it struck me that no one else would remember her. Not the world, not her neighbors, not the government. And I feared I was part of the forgetting." He spoke without trembling, but his voice carried the softness of someone who had finally arrived at an unavoidable truth. Maigret walked to the table and placed the wooden box upon it. He did not open it. "I'm not here to resolve anything," he said. "There's no charge to file, no headline to write. But I thought perhaps if you wanted to read what she wrote, this would be the time." Villette stared at the box as though it were a stone placed on his chest. He made no move toward it. "Will it help her?"
he asked. "No," Maigret said, "but it may help you." They stood there a moment longer. Then Maigret turned to go. At the door he paused. "Do you know why I became interested in this case?" Villette shook his head. "Because you asked for yesterday's paper." Maigret didn't wait for a reply. Back on the street, the sky was slowly clearing. The wind had shifted, blowing from the river now, cooler and more forgiving. He walked toward the tram stop, pipe unlit between his teeth, coat open at the throat. There was still something that puzzled him. Not a contradiction, not a missing name, but a detail he couldn't yet name. Something that hovered just outside clarity. Not everything had been said in Fantine's apartment, he was sure of it. There was more in her silences, a word unsaid, a boundary carefully guarded. But he would return, not today, not to accuse or to probe, only to wait, only to be present as he always was. The city rolled on, streetcars, bicycles, distant voices. Maigret stood on the corner, his shadow short behind him, and watched it move. In the story of Jeanine Latour, no one had committed a crime, but everyone had left something undone. The rain returned the following morning, though only lightly, a curtain of silver falling gently over the rooftops, softening the edges of chimneys and dulling the clatter of heels on the pavements. Maigret was home for once, seated by the kitchen window with a steaming cup of tea his wife had made, her quiet form moving about the room with the unhurried certainty of someone who had lived alongside him long enough to understand when silence was not absence. He had said nothing of the case, not truly, but Madame Maigret never asked for facts, she asked for rhythm, and this morning she had sensed it had shifted. "You're different this week," she said without turning, wiping down the stove with her usual precision. "You haven't eaten your apple in 2 days." Maigret smiled faintly and sipped his tea. It's a quiet case. That's always when you stop eating fruit. She paused then, wiped her hands on a towel and sat opposite him. I remember a name like that once. Latour. The woman who used to bring letters to the chemist in Montparnasse years ago. Wore gloves, even in the summer. Didn't speak unless spoken to. Maigret looked up. You're certain of the name? I think so. The pharmacist said she came every Thursday, always for the same lotion, but never asked for anything more. A very proud woman, he said, but with soft eyes, like she'd been waiting a long time for someone to recognize her. Maigret set the cup down carefully. What year? Oh, must been 56. 57. You had that burglary case in Saint-Manet, remember? The one with the butcher's wife and the stolen clock? He did remember. But not the woman. Not then. Did she ever speak to you? Only once. Asked if the train to Auteuil was still running. Then she walked away. I never saw her again after that year. He nodded slowly. You've remembered something important, he said. Madame Maigret didn't smile at the compliment. She merely folded her hands in her lap. She looked like someone who had loved once, and never stopped. It was the kind of sentence that stayed in Maigret's mind long after he had left the flat. That afternoon he returned to Rue de Moulin-des-Prés. The stairwell was still steep, still damp with smells of boiled potatoes and worn-out wood polish. He knocked gently at Fontaine's door, hearing her approach before he saw her. She opened it in the same housecoat, though her face looked more rested than before, as if something had been eased in her sleep. Inspector! May I come in? She stepped aside without a word. The flat was tidier than ever. The table was cleared. The windows cracked open just enough to let in the smell of rain. I've just made tea, she said. Would you like some? He nodded. They sat again at the lemon-printed tablecloth. This time the silence felt less guarded. I wanted to ask you something, Maigret said after a while. Something simple. She waited. Did Janine ever go to Montparnasse? Fontaine looked away slightly, then back. Yes. Regularly? Once a week? On Thursdays? Maigret nodded. She went to the chemist? She did. And after that? She walked. I think she visited a bakery she liked, maybe a cafe. But she never said. She always came back around 6. Quiet, as if the day had meant something only to her. He leaned back. My wife saw her once. Fontaine blinked. Your wife? She remembers the gloves, the quiet. Fontaine stirred her tea without drinking it. She had rituals, she said. Small ones. They gave her a shape. Thursdays were important to her. Maigret waited. She received a letter once, Fontaine continued. Only one that I ever saw. It came from someone in Toulouse. She never opened it. She left it on the mantel for years. Eventually, it faded. She never threw it away, but never read it either. Do you know who sent it? No. The envelope had only a first initial, R. Maigret made a note in his mind. He had a growing suspicion that Janine had tried, in her own way, to stay visible. If not to the world, then to someone. Thursdays in Montparnasse. A kept letter. A suitcase of unwritten replies. There was still one thing that didn't sit right. He looked up. Madame Fontaine? Why did you place the notice? She looked at him directly then, her fingers tightening slightly around the cup. Because I didn't want her to disappear, even though she asked for no attention. She didn't ask for none. She just didn't know how to ask for more. Maigret didn't respond at first. And the name? You signed it, A. Fontaine. But you didn't include yourself as next of kin. I wasn't her kin.
No, but you were something.
She looked away now out the window, where the rain was just beginning to fall again, faint and fine. I was her witness. Maigret understood. In a city like Paris, people vanished every day without vanishing at all. They moved between buildings, between conversations, between Thursday afternoons and closed mailboxes. But now and then, one person would bear quiet witness to another. Not by claiming them, but simply by remembering. He stood slowly.
I think this case is coming to an end, he said.
Fontaine did not speak. I'll leave the box with you.
Do what you think best.
She nodded once.
At the door, he turned back. She wrote about you once, briefly, just a sentence.
Fontaine's brow lifted. Maigret recited it softly. The woman who lives beside me knows more than I let her, but she keeps it like water in a glass, steady, untouched. Tears did not fall, but her shoulders moved slightly. Maigret stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind him. Outside, Paris moved as it always did, slowly, urgently, and without noticing who was missing. But somewhere above the city, in a modest sixth-floor apartment, the memory of a life had finally found its place. The following day brought with it a wind that scattered leaves across the boulevard like whispered confessions. Paris felt unsettled in a quiet way, the kind of restlessness that lingered in the air without any visible cause. Maigret noticed it in the way people paused before crossing the street, how curtains twitched at half-closed windows, how the pigeons in the square moved without direction. He arrived at the office late in the morning, unhurried and without folder in hand. The case, if one could still call it that, had dissolved into something softer, less definable. There was nothing to report to the prosecutor, no file to open or archive, and yet it occupied him more completely than cases with blood, theft, or accusations ever did. He stood at the window with his pipe unlit, watching the ripples of wind press against the trees across the... Behind him, the office was still. No phone ringing, no hurried steps from Lucas or Janvier, no briefing from the commissaire. The silence was welcome. He had nearly settled into that silence when a knock at the door drew him out. It was Lucas, his hat still in hand, eyes uncertain. "There's a man downstairs asking for you." "Who?" He wouldn't say, just that he knows the name Jondine Latour, and that it's time. Maigret raised an eyebrow. "Time for what?" Lucas spread his hands. He didn't elaborate. Send him in. A few minutes later, a man entered. Late 60s, perhaps older, with a weathered face and the cautious movements of someone used to going unnoticed. He wore a grey wool coat, fraying at the cuffs, a flat cap tucked under one arm, and shoes polished with more care than money. Maigret gestured to the chair opposite his desk. The man sat slowly. "You said you knew Janine Latour," Maigret began. "I did." The man's voice was low, textured like old paper. His hands rested in his lap, one thumb tracing slow circles against the other. "She called me the man who walked backwards." Maigret waited. "I met her when we were both younger. Not in Montmartre, but afterward. During the years no one seems to mention. 45, maybe? 46? She had just come back from somewhere. I never knew exactly where. She didn't like to talk about the war." He paused. "I was a postman then, covered parts of the 13th arrondissement. She was living in a tiny flat near the Bièvre River. I'd see her every week, sometimes with a letter, sometimes just waiting. One day she asked me if I'd ever walked backwards." Maigret frowned slightly. "Backwards?" She meant through life. She said most people walk forward, always chasing, always hoping, But some, she said, live in reverse. They begin at the moment of greatest feeling, and everything after is a quiet retreat. Maigret nodded slowly. That sounds like her. The man smiled faintly. Yes, she had that way, like a poet who didn't trust poems. He leaned forward slightly now. She gave me something once. A parcel. Told me to keep it safe. Said it wasn't to be opened unless someone came asking, but no one ever did. What was in it? I don't know. I never opened it. Where is it now? At my apartment. Rue des Peuplières. I still live there. Maigret stood. Let's go. They walked the short distance in silence. The man, who introduced himself only as Émile, lived in a modest fourth-floor room above a locksmith's shop. It was neat, the furniture old but cared for. On the mantel above the fireplace, beside a framed photograph of a much younger Émile, in postal uniform, sat a rectangular tin box, sealed with twine. Maigret stepped forward, untied it slowly. Inside, wrapped in yellowed paper, were 3 items. A single glove, left-handed, velvet. A ticket stub from a cinema that had closed in 1951, and a folded note. He opened the note first. To the one who finally asked. This is all I kept. 1 glove from the night I meant to wave goodbye. A ticket for the film I never watched because he never came, and the silence I chose in place of an answer. If you're reading this, you've already understood. Don't look for more. I lived in reverse, and some things once lost are best left behind the curtain. Yours? Maigret refolded the letter. He said nothing. Émile stood at the edge of the room, hat in hand. I always meant to return it, he said quietly. But she never asked again. She didn't need to, Maigret replied. On the tram ride back, Maigret didn't open his notebook. There was nothing to write. What had begun with a name in a newspaper, Jeanine Latour, née Lemoine, had unraveled not into a crime, but a portrait. One of a woman who had folded her own story away like linen in a drawer, carefully, without malice, without demand. Back at Quai des Orfèvres, the office buzz had returned. Lucas was discussing something with Janvier at the end of the corridor. Files passed hands, voices echoed. A detective from the 18th arrondissement stood by the coffee machine, cursing at its sputtering silence. Maigret passed them all, entered his office, and set the tin box on his desk. He stared at it a long while, then finally tucked it into the drawer, where he kept old coins, unclaimed keys, and the occasional photograph. Things that had no place in archives, but still held weight. Before heading home that evening, he made one final note in his private ledger. Jeanine Latour. A life walked backward. No mystery, no crime. Only silence made visible. He paused, then added one more line. Remembered not by what she left, but by who remained to carry it. And with that, he put on his coat, took up his hat, and stepped out into the deepening dusk. The air smelled faintly of iron and lilac. Somewhere, a piano played through an open window. A waltz. Slow and steady, and Maigret, walking slowly, felt the soft echo of yesterday under his feet. For 2 days, Maigret left the matter untouched. The tin box remained in his desk drawer. Between an old magnifying glass and a brass key he no longer remembered the origin of. He didn't speak of it to Lucas, nor did he revisit Fontaine or Villette. The threads had been tied, in a way, but something in him resisted calling it finished. It wasn't that he suspected a lie or feared a missing piece. It was more subtle than that. A lingering scent in an empty room, the sense that something had been left unsaid, not by accident, but by deliberate omission. So he waited. It was on the third morning, over his habitual second cup of black coffee at his desk, that a small envelope appeared on his blotter. It had no postage, just his name, written in tidy blue ink. Lucas, when asked, said only that it had been dropped off by a boy in a baker's apron who hadn't given a name. Maigret opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. Rue des Feuillantines, number 14, third floor, right, ledger in back closet, beneath the ironing board. She wrote them down. Not just the letters, the people. You'll understand when you see it. A witness. No signature. But Maigret didn't need one. He pocketed the note, stood, and took his coat from the hook. He didn't rush. He moved with that same patient, inward certainty that guided him through hallways and neighborhoods and lives. Outside, the air was cool again, clean after the rain. The light, diffuse but strong, Rue des Feuillantines lay nestled between quiet lanes of the 5th arrondissement, a street few tourists stumbled upon. Number 14 was a building like many others, narrow, with shuttered windows, and a worn bell that buzzed faintly when pressed. He climbed the stairs alone, slowly, breathing in the soft scent of starch and furniture polish. The third-floor door opened on the right. It was unlocked. He stepped inside. The flat was unoccupied, but not abandoned. The air still held warmth, and on the kitchen table lay a half-folded dish towel beside an open tin of biscuits. Someone had lived here recently, perhaps even that morning. But they were not present now. Maigret moved without intrusion. The note had not lied. There was an ironing board propped against the wall in a back closet, and beneath it, a thick, leather-bound ledger wrapped in waxed cloth. He took it to the table and opened it. The pages were handwritten, line after line, in a firm, compact script. Names, dates, fragments of memories, not letters. This was something different. A record. A kind of private registry. 1947, Jules B., pharmacist's son, smiled with a limp. 1952, Claudine F., always wore red boots. Disappeared after her brother died. 1955, Emile T., postal route, never opened his letters. 1956, A.M., wife of a police commissaire, asked for directions but needed company. Maigret froze. A.M. His wife. He turned the page slowly. 1956. Madame. M. Thursdays, Montparnasse chemist, asked me if the train to Auteuil still ran. Told her it did. She thanked me, with a silence. It was her, Madame Maigret. She had remembered the name because Janine had remembered her first. He closed the book, not out of fear or sentiment, but out of quiet awe. Janine had chronicled more than letters or regrets. She had preserved encounters, however fleeting. Not for fame, not for ego, but as a way of existing, of making the invisible visible again. In the front cover of the ledger, taped gently with 2 corners of aged adhesive, was a small note. If no one asks, let it go. If someone does, give them the whole story. Everyone deserves to be seen once. There was no name, but the handwriting matched the letters in the box. Maigret remained seated for a long while. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a fullness. The way air feels before a snowfall, or how the first chord of a remembered song lands in the chest. When he left the apartment, he locked the door behind him and left the key on the hook inside. Outside, A child rode past on a bicycle, with a paper bag of groceries swinging from the handlebars. Life untouched and continuing. That evening, he sat with his wife in the kitchen. The radio murmured a distant waltz. He helped her peel potatoes for dinner, the skins curling gently into the sink. "She remembered you," he said, almost as an afterthought. Madame Maigret looked up from the cutting board. "Him? Who?" "The woman in Montparnasse, the one with the gloves." His wife gave a soft sound, part chuckle, part breath. "She had kind eyes," she said. They didn't speak more of it. They didn't need to. After dinner, Maigret stepped out briefly to walk to the corner tobacconist. On his way back, he paused under the street lamp by their building, looking up at the windows glowing with domestic light. In his pocket, he carried nothing but a folded page from the ledger. The line that mattered. "The woman who thanked me with a silence." It was enough. Not all cases were solved with fingerprints and confessions. Some were resolved only when a life had been fully witnessed, when its quiet corners were seen by someone who cared to look. Jeanine Latour had not died invisible, and Maigret, the man who listened, who waited, had helped ensure she would not remain forgotten. He climbed the steps home slowly, already smelling the faint perfume of supper and starch, and knew, without a doubt, that the story was almost over. The weather shifted again 2 days later. A dry wind arrived from the west, sweeping the city clean of dampness, leaving the streets brighter, the cafes noisier, and the clouds thinner and higher. But the light, though clearer, did little to lift the heaviness Maigret still carried with him. Not burden, not exactly, but the echo of something that had stayed too long. He'd returned to the precinct, resumed the ordinary rhythm of files and interviews, reviewed a petty theft case from Montmartre, and signed off on a stalled investigation from the Rue Saint-Lazare. Everything around him was functional, flowing again. But Maigret remained half outside it, as if part of him still stood in that empty flat on Rue des Feuillantines, holding the ledger. That ledger had changed everything, not because of what it proved, but because of how it revealed a life, not through facts, but through fragments. Human glimpses recorded not in the language of confession, but of careful remembering. Names, gestures, a glance on a train, things lost to almost anyone else but her. That morning, Lucas stepped in with a fresh report in hand, but paused at the door. "Chief, there's a woman asking for you. She's waiting downstairs. Said it's personal." Maigret looked up. "Her name?" "She wouldn't give it, but she said she was a friend of Jeanine Latour." Maigret blinked once, then stood. "Send her in." A few minutes later, a woman entered. She was in her mid-50s, perhaps older, with thick dark hair pulled into a twist at the nape, and gloves she didn't remove. Her coat was pressed but modest. She walked like someone with balance, both physical and emotional. Someone who knew how to carry silence. "Thank you for seeing me," she said. Her voice was low, melodic, without trying. "Please," Maigret said, gesturing to the chair. She sat carefully. "I only recently heard about Jeanine," she said. "I was away. Northern Spain, near the border. I return once a year, and this time I came back too late." "Were you family?" "No, but she called me her sister. In the way that matters?" Maigret nodded. "Well, we met in 48. Shared a small flat in Montrouge for 6 months, both of us trying to start again. I was painting then. Jeanine had found work altering stage costumes for a little cabaret near République." "What was her life like then?" The woman looked out the window for a moment. She was already withdrawing. Not from people, but from the future. She didn't believe in it. She said once that she had spent her hope too early, like someone who spent their wages on the first day and then had to live on memory. Maigret said nothing. She never spoke of family, only of a man, never named, who had once brought her lilies every Saturday. That was her measure of love. Someone who remembers the day without needing to be reminded. And what brought you here? She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded envelope. It was addressed simply to J.L. in careful blue ink. She wrote this years ago, but never sent it. Gave it to me instead, to be delivered if something ever happened. I didn't think she meant it, but when I returned and heard, she placed the letter on Maigret's desk. She wrote it to you, the woman said quietly. Maigret frowned. To me? I think so. She never used your name, but she called it for the one who waits in quiet places. She must have heard of you, perhaps from Fontaine, or perhaps only imagined you. He opened it slowly. To the one who waits, I have no great truth to share, no secret to unlock. Only this. I existed. I lived in corners. I was the name someone forgot, but still hoped would be spoken. I never caused harm. I didn't save anyone. But I watched. I remembered. I wrote things down so they wouldn't be erased. If you have found this, then someone has listened. And for that, not for justice, or honor, or closure, I am grateful. Janine Maigret folded the letter once more. The woman stood. She never asked to be seen, only not to be erased. He nodded. I'll see that she isn't. As the woman turned to leave, Maigret asked gently, What should I call you, if anyone asks? She paused at the door. Call me nothing, she said with a soft smile, Alwith just a voice at her window. After she left, Maigret sat alone with the letter in front of him. The morning had shifted into midday. The city beyond the window sparkled faintly with wind-polished light. Bells rang faintly from a school nearby. He reached into the drawer and removed the ledger once more. He found the page with the list from 1956, where his wife's initials had been noted, and turned to the next page. There, near the bottom, in faded ink, The man who waits in quiet places. I have not met him, but I think he exists. He traced the line with his thumb, then closed the book. No crime, no arrest, no trial, and yet it was one of the most complete cases of his career. Because Janine had not needed someone to find her, only someone to know she had been there. He stood, straightened his coat, and walked slowly to the courtyard below, where light fell softly against the stone. In the stillness, he lit his pipe and let the smoke rise into the pale sky, carrying with it not an ending, but a presence. Unforgotten, unnamed in the record books, but inscribed somewhere far more lasting. The rain returned one final time. It came not with fury, but in a soft, unending rhythm, a veil that seemed to hang between buildings, slowing the city's pulse. Paris under rain was not sad, only thoughtful. It became quieter, more watchful, like a man standing in a doorway, waiting for someone who would not come. Maigret watched it fall from the narrow window of his office, arms folded, the pipe cold in his hand. He had not lit it all morning. There was nothing urgent left to do, no one else to visit. The case, or whatever one might call it, had resolved itself without a verdict, without even a question of guilt, and yet it stayed with him. Not as an unsolved problem, but as an aftertaste. It was Lucas who finally interrupted the silence, knocking once and stepping in with his usual subdued air. "There's a request from the Bureau of Archives," he said. "They want to know whether to file anything under Latour." Maigret turned slowly. "There's no case," he said. "No criminal record. No incident." Lucas hesitated. "Not even the letters? The ledger?" "They don't belong to us. They belong to her." Lucas nodded and turned to go, but Maigret called him back. "One thing. Do we still have that photographer, the one from the identification division? The quiet one, Leclerc?" "Yes, still works the late shift." "Tell him to bring his camera tonight. Nothing official. I'll meet him on Rue Cardinal Lemoyne, number 17, around 8. Lucas blinked, but didn't ask why. That evening the rain had lightened to a mist again, just enough to dot the shoulders of Maigret's coat as he walked the narrow sidewalks of the Latin Quarter. The streets here were older, quieter, their stones worn smooth, not just by feet, but by years of stories told and retold. The lamps glowed like halos in the damp, and down an alley, a cat padded through puddles like it had done so 100 times before. At number 17, he paused. It was an old pension, one of those buildings with 3 bells and no sign, its facade covered in faint traces of ivy and the smell of dust after rainfall. He entered without ringing. The door yielded to a familiar push. Inside, the staircase creaked beneath his weight, not with protest but familiarity. He climbed slowly, then made his way to the topmost landing, where a short hallway led to 2 small rooms. One of them had belonged to Janine in 1962. For 6 months, according to the registry, he'd found it in the ledger. Just a footnote beside a name. Rue Cardinal Lemoyne, top floor, rainy spring. She smiled at the pigeons. That was the note. That was enough. The door to the old room was open, not broken into, not abandoned. The landlady, who lived 2 floors below, had given him the key and said she always paid in exact change and left quietly. Maigret stood in the doorway now. The room was small. A bed, a narrow desk, a low shelf of books so old the titles had faded from the spines. A teacup turned upside down on the sill. A window with 1 cracked pane, letting in the sound of water trickling from the gutter. Nothing of value. And yet, as he stepped inside, the place felt full, not of things, but of presence. He heard footsteps behind him. Leclerc had arrived, carrying his worn leather camera case like a priest with a relic. The man said nothing. He simply waited for instruction. Maigret gestured to the room. "Take a photo." Leclerc blinked. "Of what?" "Of the whole room. As it is." He nodded, set up his camera, adjusted the lens, the angle. The shutter clicked softly 3 times. "And one more," Maigret said, stepping aside. He knelt by the window, reached to the shelf, and picked up one of the books. A thin volume of poetry by a forgotten writer, the pages marked by time. He placed it on the table, then beside it, a folded napkin he found tucked under the bedpost. Nothing dramatic, just human. Leclerc took the final photo. When he left, Maigret remained in the room. He lit his pipe at last, letting the smoke rise toward the cracked plaster ceiling. He didn't know what he wanted, perhaps only to feel time pass in a place where she had once waited out the rain. He didn't stay long. On his way out, he stopped by the landlady's apartment to return the key. "She died?" the woman asked, not out of malice, but from habit. "Yes," the woman sighed. "She was polite. Never left the lights on too long, never brought noise." Maigret smiled faintly. "She never brought much. But she left something behind. That night, back at his flat, he removed his coat and hung it to dry. Madame Maigret was seated by the fire with her knitting, glasses perched on her nose. She looked up as he entered. "You stayed out late." "I did." "Did it matter?" He nodded once, slow and steady. Yes, quietly. She folded her yarn, stood, and kissed him on the cheek without asking more. Later, alone in his study, he placed the 4 photographs on his desk. They were plain. A modest room under a sloping roof, a shelf, a desk, a crack in the window pane. But to Maigret, they captured something rare. The afterglow of someone who had never asked to be remembered, and yet had been. He placed them in a manila envelope and sealed it. On the outside, he wrote just one word in pencil. Latour. He placed it on the top shelf of his private cabinet, the one with no label, where he kept the stories that didn't belong to anyone, but somehow had found their way to him. Then he sat down once more, lit his pipe again, and looked out over the rooftops of Paris. Somewhere, not far from him, the city continued, unaware, unbothered, unchanged. But Jeanine Latour would not be erased, and Maigret, the man who listened, who waited, who noticed the rain when others ignored it, had made sure of that.